All right, now we're going to pass it over to John Carmichael to give us a presentation and talk a little bit about the management challenges.
Yeah, so I've been expecting black sea bass to be an interesting topic and a bit of a rabbit hole, and it has not disappointed in that regard. It's disappointing in a whole lot of other regards, though, as we've all seen this morning. So after listening to the SSC discussions and looking into sort of how black sea bass was doing, and reflecting on the past history, this is probably our most assessed stock. I'm pretty certain it goes back to CDR2. It's had multiple updates, multiple assessments. So we have a rich history to look into, and it's been through some interesting stanzas in its population. So I just wanted to try and bring that together, and I knew these presentations this morning were complicated, and try to bring this thing together with some different ways of looking at the same information. And so the caveat there is just, I pulled a lot of pieces from a lot of different sources and tried to indicate them along the way. But this is just trying to give you a big picture view of the challenge that you face and what we may want to be able to do with black sea bass and how these various pieces of information are all coming together and really what has happened with this population. So the first thing is just look at CDR 76. Here's some significant outcomes from the assessment, which is the relative fishing mortality rate, whether or not you're overfishing in blue, the relative spawning stock biomass, whether or not you're overfished in orange, and a bright red line. You want the orange above the red and you want the blue below the red. And the green line is the recruitment, with the straight green line being the reference that shows the long-term recruitment that's used in the OFL projections. So what this shows is coming out of CDR 76, as you heard, stock is overfished, but it's not overfishing. What you really want to pay attention to and try to keep this period in here in mind as we go through this, which is really 2009 to about 2015. As you can see here, there's a big inflection in your recruitment and in your spawning stock biomass, and as expected, SSB lags a little bit behind recruits. When your recruits start falling, a few years later, your SSB is going to fall. If your recruits keep falling, your SSB is going to keep falling. That's just the way a population works. There's no way around it. You'll also notice, and this was mentioned, is in the last few years of the assessment, you don't really have a lot of information on which to estimate recruitment. So usually the terminal year will be set the same as the year before. We didn't have a survey in 2020 because of COVID. So what's happened here in this is the last 2 years of recruitment, look down here in this little yellow circle, are both the same. Those aren't really estimates, they're averages of the couple of years before. That should make you suspicious that this little blip that might say, oh, look, things maybe you turned around, is not really real. And as Jeff just showed in the SSC report, looking at the actual index, the index has not tipped up. If anything, the index is sort of down here where it was in about 2019. So that's a little bit of optimism that you probably shouldn't go to the bank on. I certainly would. So let's look at our history of this stock. As I said, there's been a lot of assessments. The stock now is not overfishing. That was not the case in any of our prior assessments. In CDR2, initially, the light blue line, we thought this stock was severely overfishing. A lot changed from CDR2 to these other assessments. That one used a whole different modeling approach. It was predicated on length, not ages, differences in the inputs. So we're not gonna look at that one anymore. Put that out of your mind. Next, we came to CDR 25 in the gray line, which ended here in 2012. So remember, keep this sort of 2015 in mind, because you've got CDR 25, you've got CDR 56, you had your recruits past their peak, you had SSB already turned the corner. But in CDR 25, we thought, yeah, we've been overfishing most of the time, but hey, we finally got it under control. CDR 56, we're like, well, we were overfishing. We were worse overfishing than we thought, but you know, hey, we're getting it back under control. CDR 76, we've come along and we're like, other than 1 year, we've never been overfishing in this stock. So when we think about what's causing the problem with the productivity, we say, you know, overfishing often leads to declines in recruitment. We had declines in recruitment without overfishing occurring. Something's going on with this population to contribute to a decade of declining recruitment or more. And based on the estimates we have from the assessment, it doesn't seem like overfishing is really to be implicated in this case, as it so often is in fisheries. Now let's look at the biomass. Again, we want the biomass to be high, so we want to keep this up above the red line. And if we look back at CDR2, we thought the stock was not only severely overfishing, we thought it was severely overfished. Not gonna look at that one anymore. But if you look at our couple of assessments there in the interim, the orange and the gray in CDR 56 and CDR 25, you can see there was a lot of cause for optimism in CDR 25. The SSB was going up. We'd come out of being overfished. Things are looking good. We were in rebuilding times at that point based on the prior assessments. And at CDR 25, we were above MSST, so we were no longer overfished, but we were still in the rebuilding plan because we were not recovered, because you have to get to the MSY level to be recovered. So we were kind of in that interim place that you get with most stocks you expect to get to late in your rebuilding plan. Then we did CDR 56, decided the stock was recovered. We really weren't overfished during those times, despite being in rebuilding plans. But we did have a little bit of an indication of some concern where we have this declining limb here at the end of the orange, where we're saying, you know, the SSB was coming down. And that was really a precursor for where you see we are now on CDR 76, where you're like, yeah, it was coming down. And unlike a lot of past years where it sort of go up and down, where you had this in the middle of the orange and the gray, it hasn't come back. And that's created a situation that we're in today. So all those old assessments led us to a lot of yesterday's problem. We had rebuilding, we had overfishing, we had recovering. This stock was in rebuilding plans for 20 years. The CDR 76 says, I don't think you needed to be in rebuilding. You weren't ever overfished. So that's just tells us how these assessments can be uncertain. And as the models evolve, as we get better research, as we get better sampling, as we get better inputs, sometimes some of our old perceptions can be challenged by the new information and give us a new outlook on the stock. So, you know, part of this is to say we have a rich history of management on this, but in a lot of cases it was appropriate management for what was going on at the time. We just know now that there's a little bit of a different situation going on. So this really is just to say, you know, I don't think the council can beat itself up too much over the situation where we are, this stock having gone through such a decline, because you were acting appropriately for the information you had at the time. And all these amendments are on the website. If you want to look at those and understand the information are good, I just put this in there to give you a sense of, you know, the rich history of management that has gone into this population over the years. So I mentioned how our perceptions changes for these different stocks. And one of the big ways it changes is, as we all know, because the inputs change. And we mentioned the FES earlier, the changes in the MRIP program, the importance of recreational fishing in this population, the importance of the discards. All that's affected by MRIP. So a lot of these figures are going to look at what's been going on in MRIP. And one of the big things you see is this is the total estimate of the MRIP discards and thousands of fish. This isn't the dead fish, so it's not affected by any changes in discard mortality that might have happened over time. This is what was used as input to the assessment from MRIP at the time the assessment was done. So if you look at the orange and the gray, 25 and 56, you see that there was a fairly consistent trend in magnitude in the discards, not a big change. But then get into CDR 76, and we're dealing with, recall the FES change, which was a major change in the estimation of the recreational effort going back into the time when they say, you know, cell phones started being used. That's why you see this divergence between the blue and the orange and the gray starting back here around 98, and you see it get greater and greater over time because the adjustment factor for that became greater over time. But what you can see is a huge increase in the amount of estimated discards for this population. And if you remember from the earlier discussions about this, we've already mentioned how available these are inshore, inland areas, and those were some of the sectors of MRIP that were most affected by this adjustment in the effort, which we talked about a lot. And Florida was a state that had big increases in the amount of inshore effort, and that translated into big increases and the encounters of some of these stocks. And so these changes in inputs contribute to some of these estimation changes over time and these challenges. And this just captures sort of how there's been a number of changes in MRIP over the years, and the different assessments had to go through different steps to incorporate this. And we had the MERS period, we have the MRIP when it was revised period, then they did the access point changes, which is the dockside interviews, that had a recalculation going back, and then we brought in FES. And the good thing about FES is it kind of brought all that stuff together and gave us one comprehensive adjustment to the numbers to go forward with. And at least the assessments are not having now to go through multiple conversions of the MRIP data to get their inputs. That's the good part of it. The bad part is we recently learned that there may continue to be problems and those estimates could be biased. And that's something we're going to have to factor in down the road. But that's not enough reason for us not to be acting on this stock, which hopefully I'll make a case for. Because today's problem is the declining abundance, the increasing discards, an overfished stock that's nearly overfishing. So a couple of pictures I put together in here. This first one on the left shows the population abundance of age 1+ fish, leaving out the recruits, because the recruits are half the population most of the time. So just looking at the 1+. That's the blue. I mean, that's the orange, and then the blue is the video survey. What's really interesting in this is that the decline in the blue and the decline in the orange are lockstep. This index is doing an incredible job at predicting the abundance of this population, which is one of the reasons Jeff mentioned this is a good stock for an interim, because we do have an index that seems to do a really great job at tracking what's going on in this population. It also tells us, despite the uncertainties that we have, and despite the uncertainty in basic inputs such as MRIP, we have evidence from an independent source that says this stock has been in decline for over a decade. So this isn't a case where I think we can, use the evidence and the uncertainty to say, well, maybe we don't need to act. I think it's pretty clear that we need to act. The other thing I noticed in this, so if we look at the figure on the right, I'm showing the MRIP discard. So that's the B2 fish in the blue line, and then the percent of the total fish encountered and estimated in MRIP that was discarded. So and that's the orange. So what this shows is if you go back in the 80s and 90s, about 30, 40%, maybe up to 50% by 1990 of all the fish encountered by MRIP and estimated in the program were being thrown back. But the concerning part of this is this trend increases significantly over time. In recent years, as has been mentioned, we're throwing back over 90%, in some cases 99% of the fish that are being encountered in the private recreational fishery and MRIP are being thrown back. And that is a huge problem in any fishery that you're going to have to try and solve. And we talk about discard mortality, barotrauma, a lot of species. This is not one of those species that suffers from a lot of barotrauma impacts. The discard mortality is 13%. I personally don't believe many fisheries ever achieve a discard mortality below 10%. I think bass fishermen in tournaments, are discarding and losing 5 to 10% of their fish. We don't have a lot of meat on the bone to make improvements here from, say, reducing discard mortality, because it's already pretty daggone low. That means we have to go after the blue, which is the magnitude of discards. That's where we have a huge number, and we can probably bring some force to bear and make a difference in this population. And with the other thing that's concerning, and this really shows it with this line being by itself, is just how much those numbers of discards have increased from, say, 1995 up until present. And you also see a big spike right in here. So I remember like 2013, et cetera, we had those recruitment spikes. Then you have an availability in the fishery spike a few years later. So you have an increase in discards that goes along with that increased availability. You're killing those fish. You're not getting recruitments coming in. Well, here's another sign that the stock's not doing well, because even the number of discards is going down. The evidence is there. It's incontrovertible. So recruitment's a problem. It's been declining. What's this really mean? This is a figure from the stock assessment. Just shows the deviations, how well recruitment was estimated relative to what was predicted it should have been. This shows us this decline in recruitment, this recruitment failure. And what I was interested in is, what does that really mean? And something you can wrap your head around other than little circles on a graph, on a log graph, it doesn't mean anything. So the long-term R that's used in those OFL projections that we talked about was 71 million fish. The estimated average recruitment from 2010 to 2019, so during this period of decline, was 45 million fish. This includes 2010, which was a pretty decent year, about where expected, 45 million fish. The average from 2015 to 2019 was only 20 million fish, 21. So that means over 10 years, relative to what we expected for recruitment and long-term average, we lost 260 million fish from this population from recruitment failure alone. In just 5 years, we've lost 240 million from not getting that expected recruitment. So this stock is at very low abundance, and it's recruitment failure that's causing it. And those are huge holes to dig out of in terms of getting back to the average conditions that will rebuild the stock to the levels that are shown on those long-term projections for OFL that use that 70 million, as Carolyn was questioning earlier. You know, you're not going to get back to that level of stock, as Shannon said, if you're only getting 20 million fish. You'll never get to a stock that you estimate you're at when you get 70 million recruits if you're only ever getting 20. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious to everybody. And there's been a huge cost to this population from that loss of recruitment. So we've had that long-term decline in landed fish, we've had a long-term decline in population, and the discards are taking over. So again, we have our blue discard line, probably got this seared into your memory by now. The orange is the total number of landed fish. They're estimated in the stock assessment. What's interesting here is you see landings started out, you know, fairly high. The highest that we've seen were back in the early 80s. And it's really on a fairly regular declining trend throughout time. There's a few little blips, which corresponded with occasional good year classes back in the 00s and late 90s. But in general, it's just kind of come down. And it's really come down in recent years, which should be cause for concern. And the gray is the discard dead numbers. And in the early years, the discard dead numbers were trivial relative to what was being caught. But notice that starts to shift here around 2000. You see the discard dead going up, see the landings coming down. About 2012 or so, suddenly now there's more discarded dead fish being taken from the population than landed fish. And then you get to where you are now, and they're the bulk of what's being taken out of the population. So there's been a shift somehow, some way, in whatever's going on in this population, that we used to have a lot of fish, and a lot of fish were caught and not a lot of discards. Now we're getting a lot of discards. It could be the inshore, it could be different effort trends. I don't think we really know yet, but I do believe we're going to have to get to some answers on this if we're going to change fisherman behavior, better understand this fishery, and break that assumption of the high discards in the future. So that's our past. What about tomorrow? So what does this mean for the future? How we're going to rebuild the stock? One thing that we mentioned is those projection scenarios carry those recent conditions into the future. We have the ABC, which carries the recent recruits into the future, and both of them carry the high F on discards in the last 2 years into the future. And that's going to have an impact on where our projections go. What are future recruitment levels? We don't know. And then there's the issue of climate impacts. Is that affecting this stock? The northern stock, which we used to, you know, we manage basically to Cape Hatteras, then there's a stock managed by the Mid-Atlantic, which went from there north. That stock has been shifting northward for years. And that stock is right now 2.5 times BMSY. Stock's in amazing shape. They've been having incredible recruitment, with a lot of it occurring on places like Connecticut. So really different situations between our stock of black sea bass and a more northern stock of black sea bass. And we're going to have to probably look into that as well and really understand our boundaries. So getting back into the projections, then I put together what we have for the past conditions, which is the estimated going to the left into the older years from the terminal year of 2021. And then the projections, which are, as we've seen this morning from Shannon's presentation, and Jeff showed the numbers from that, which is to the right under the yellow arrow. So the total removals from the population is the blue, and then the recruitments is the orange. And so this is for the OFL. So this is the long-term recruitment projection. So if you look at the orange line and you look at the history, yeah, you can see that this line here about 77, that's consistent with what you think that average is. And you look at the total removals of the stock, you'd say, well, that looks reasonable for this population to get to based on the history. You know, it's not out of line with what we've observed. So it doesn't look altogether too bad. The problem is when we throw a little bit of more information on this thing, and let's look at landings and discards and the total removals. So this orange line here, again, that's the percent of the yield that the population provided that was dead discarded. The blue is the total removals from the population, landings and discards over all time in numbers. And numbers are good to use for this because you're not dealing with pounds and changes in fish age and everything else. And fish die as a number. They don't die by the pound, they die by the number. So it's the numbers that are driving fish mortality and that sort of thing. The red is the dead discard. So one thing I want to point out is you start out in the early years, the green landings and the blue total removals line up together, right? There's not a lot of discards going on. You start to see some separation here in the early 2000s, where we see the blue starting to get distance from the green. The green's going down, the blue staying up there. We see the red, that's the dead discard numbers, going up. We reached this point around 2014. Remember 2013, there's something's going on in there. You see where the dead discards and the landings are about the same. And then we see the discards start to eclipse the landings. And then we're carrying forward into the projections that fish and mortality rate of the last few years. And what that's doing is it's saying that almost all of the fish removed from this population are red. They're dead discards. Very few of the fish to be removed from the population in the projection period under the OFL are landed. So if you think about what rebuilding scenarios are supposed to do, the idea is that gives you a blueprint for how you manage this stock. And if you follow that blueprint, you achieve these outcomes and you rebuild your fishery. The huge thing that really bothers me here is saying, if we follow this blueprint and we follow these landings ratios, we are going to create a fishery that's discard driven. We've got to do something that changes this ratio and doesn't rely upon the assumption that the F of discards will never change and creates this outcome. This is a red snapper outcome all over again. This is what will happen if we get a good year class, imagine, then suddenly we're going to have lots of fish available. We're trying to keep this fishery at a very low harvest level. The discards will occur. Even if you didn't allow harvest in the EEZ, the discards will occur because, as we said, a lot of these fish are encountered in inshore and inland waters by people who aren't even considering to be fishing for a snapper grouper, much less a black sea bass. So that's a real challenge. And I think as we work on how we rebuild this stock, we have to prevent just having the outcome of these projections become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because we can't, I mean, this is a violation of a national standard to knowingly create a fishery that's based on waste. So we have got to do something different, because if you put in those landings levels and you say, fishermen, you can only keep, a couple thousand fish, and then you get a good population, you are going to force the fishermen to throw back those discards. These are, what you're looking at there really falls under regulatory discards completely. We have to keep that from happening. And even if there weren't overfishing occurring, these discard losses decrease the yield. So CDR 76 with the FES and higher population numbers, the higher removals give you higher population numbers. We get some more pounds in the population, but not what you would think because of the discard losses. So what these two figures show is the estimated equilibrium yield, the MSY essentially, under CDR 25 and then under CDR 26. So on the left, this is the pounds of fish yield for black sea bass. And on the right is the numbers yield black sea bass, with the leftmost bar being 25 and the rightmost bar being CDR 76 in each graph. So you look at CDR 25, we had mostly blue, mostly landed fish, and just a little bit of pounds of discards. You look at it in numbers, we had, a few more in numbers because discards are smaller than landings on average. But still, we're keeping a lot of the fish. You go to CDR 76, in terms of pounds, those small discards are a vast amount of poundage because there's so daggone many of them. We get much less poundage yield than we had in CDR 25. There's a bigger stock because we're losing so many fish to the discards. You really see it in terms of numbers, where the blue numbers that are kept in CDR 76 at equilibrium are trivial compared to the huge orange bar, which is what we would be killing in discards if we don't change the assumptions that are going into this somehow. The council's got to do some sort of management to change that. And there's a huge payoff. If we could get to the CDR 76 population with CDR 25 discard rates, MSY could double. And just shifting 50% of the current discards to landings could add 1.5 million pounds of yield. We're talking about tens of pounds of yield. And yet, if we can shift some of those discards and keep them from being discarded and be able to keep them, then we're going to drastically increase this yield. So the payoff is huge, and the payoff to the population is huge. Just, getting there is tough. So the scenarios that we looked at, Carolyn raised the questions about the different places the OFL and ABC are going. So this is just sort of showing you for the projection scenarios along with where the stock has been, how things play out. So the blue is the recruitment estimates here on the left. So we're showing this is the differences in the projected recruitments under the OFL and ABC projections. Gets at the heart of what Carolyn was asking. So under the short-term ABC projections, we're assuming this 20-some million fish. Under the long-term OFL, we're assuming the green 71 or something, 77 million fish. It's a big difference. And the bottom line is if you're getting red recruits, you're never going to get to a green stock size. But you will get to a stock size. It'll just be a stock size. It's probably a third of the green because you're getting a third of the recruits, right? And a lot of the assessment stuff is just that simple. It's a lot of common sense in here. Just think about it. Recruitment is driving this stuff. If you're getting a third of the recruits, you're going to get a third of the yield. You're going to get a third of the SSB when you get to equilibrium. It's that simple. On the right is the SSB. And again, you can see, with the low recruitment, the SSB is going to be in the red and it's going to stay low. But with the green recruitment, the SSB is going to really skyrocket up. The challenge in this is, the OFL is assuming that you're getting to that higher recruitment. Snap your fingers. We're already there. We're looking at 2024. If we were getting a higher recruitment, this would assume, hey, we're already at a much better stock size than we were 6-7 years ago. We know that recruitment's never going to go like this. It's going to be jagged like the estimates were. But the projections are assuming this sort of thing goes forward. And there's uncertainty around them as Shannon's graph shows. You remember the gray shading went way, way up high because it's gross uncertainty in where we're also getting. But the big question is, what the heck has recruitment done since 2019? When we had our last estimate. And as we saw in the figure that Jeff showed for the index, probably not that good. We don't know, we haven't estimated, but it sure seems to track very well with that index, and that index is not looking good. So another way of looking about what this issue of the fate of the fish in the rebuilding scenarios, and I think this really puts a good, maybe the last nail in this coffin, but it's such an important topic, is, this is what the OFL projected landings and discards look like, with the orange being the discards, the blue being the landings. And I mean, this hits you right in the face, right? When you get out here to 2030, 2034, your stock's almost rebuilt, but you've got a discard-driven fishery. And that's where these projections are taking us, and that's the part that we really have to change. So the question is, can we get to that 1990 stock abundance that we're trying to get to in 2030? But restore 1990s discard levels of only 10 to 20%, rather than fulfilling this prophecy of these projections and having 95% discard losses because we set really low ABCs and ACLs and force the discards. We know a couple of things are true. If we're going to increase abundance, we got to have a low overall F. We can't be overfishing. Thankfully, we haven't really been, but we can't let it start. But we do have to deal with those discards, and we need to have better recruitment. So we don't really control recruitment. We don't control the environment. We don't know what these stocks are going to do. The best we can do as managers is to try to create conditions so that if we get good environmental conditions, we have a stock that can take advantage of it. That's the best that we can do. That's why we try to restore H structure and SSB, so that if things go well, then yeah, we can get a good year class out of it, but it doesn't always happen. To change the discard future in the yellow, we got to change how this fishery functions. The payoff for us is MSY pounds and really a fishery satisfaction. People are going to have access. So we got to look at the discards. We've talked some about the discards by area. Here's just a pull from the MRIP program showing the various discards by area. Inland is orange, ocean inside of 3 miles is light blue, and ocean greater than 3 miles is green. So you can see in this, particularly in recent years, you do see the orange kind of ticking up. And there's a big drop there in 2018-ish. I'm not sure what that's about, but certainly there's been an increase in the inland discards. The percent of discards that are inland has not really a lot of trend though, really. If you look, that's the red line here, very variable, but probably somewhere around 50 to 60%. So that means 50 to 60% of what's being discarded is occurring inland, inside of the inlets, in state waters, in the estuaries, in the rivers, in the bays and sounds, by people, as Tom mentioned, they're not fishing for snapper grouper or black sea bass. The other thing is, we see the higher discards over time, but if you think of all those regulations on the earlier slide, we've done actions that are toward increasing discards, higher sizes, lower bags, and recall we have a difference between the commercial and recreational size. And I think that is a huge issue here in this population. So how do different commercial and recreational size limits impact the discard pattern? So a couple facts. Commercials at 11 inches, recs at 13. These fish are going pretty quick at that. And age 3 is estimated to be a 10.5-inch fish, and age 5 is estimated to be a 13-inch fish. There's uncertainty both ways. There's uncertainty of size across ages, and there's uncertainty of ages across sizes, but this is the average that comes out of the stock assessment. So what that simply tells you is commercial guys are fishing on fish for 2-year classes before recreational guys are keeping the fish. So that's pulling fish out of the population. So we mentioned selectivity. These are the selectivity estimates out of the assessment. Selectivity, I know, is a challenging concept. Really what it says is there's a fishing mortality rate for each fleet in the assessment. So you have commercial lines, a commercial pots, a head boat, a general rec, and you have landings and discards for both. Those are all essentially, in the language of the assessment, those are fleets. They all have an annual fishing mortality rate. And then the selectivity says how much of that fishing mortality rate is applied to any given age within the population. So the fact that like these go to 1 doesn't mean you're killing all the fish. That means that the full fishing mortality rate, say for commercial discards, is experienced by 3-year-old fish, and virtually none is experienced by, say, 9-year-old fish. So here we have the landings discard in the blues and greens, with the commercial fisheries being in green and the recreational fisheries being in blue. And then the overlay is just saying the predicted size at age. So the green arrows and the blue arrows line up with what's about the average that each fishery can catch, just showing that there's a difference in what's going on here. So you see the commercial guys over here on the right, they're orange. They're throwing back a fair number of relatively young fish, which we expect. We have a pot fishery with a scape fence, and there's a need. They're going to keep a legal size fish if they can. And so they're throwing back mostly small fish. And then we see we have the recreational fishery that's throwing back small fish, younger fish as well, but a little bit shifted. They're more 4s, more 5s, etc. And that's because they're forced to, because they have a higher size limit. And so the really important thing here to me is, as I said, 3-year-old fish a commercial guy might keep, rec guy can't keep until 5. So for one thing, the rec guys are cycling through 3- and 4-year-old fish that aren't 13 inches, throwing them back, potentially killing 13% of them that the commercial guy could keep. But then they're also having to encounter all of those 3-year-old fish trying to catch a legal fish. We raised the bag limit from 5 to 7, really kind of told fishermen, hey, now a successful trip is 7. Because that affects fishermen's psyches a lot of time and their behavior. I'm no sociologist. I'm not going to pretend to be, Christina. But you put a limit out there for a lot of fishermen, that becomes a target and defines a successful trip. So fishermen might have used to stop at 5. We raised the limit to 7. Well, now they're going to fish for 7, and they're continuing to go through 3-year-old, 4-year-old, even 5-year-old fish, trying to get that legal 5.5, 6-year-old fish that's 13 inches. I think that's part of the recent discard problem. I really do. I thought it was part of the going to be a problem when we put this regulation in place years ago. And Chip mentioned the work that Mike did that showed, going to the higher limit in the bag limit was still probably not likely to achieve the ACL. And turned out we haven't. And an interesting statistic, I looked at the assessment. So it just looked at some cohorts, some year classes, all fish born in a given year. And I said, when a given year of birth fish were age 4 versus when they were age 6, what's the difference in their abundance? And it's about 25%. So the population has declined at age by 75% between age 4 and age 6. So there's a lot fewer of those age 6 fish out there for the recreational guys. So they're throwing back small fish, and there's a lot fewer of these older fish. So we are potentially encouraging longer fishing trips to try and catch legal black sea bass, which is more encounters of so many other snapper grouper species. I'm hoping to bring this together. You can see how all these little pieces fit together that are driving the nature of this fishery. And things like raising the possession limit on black sea bass years ago might have had unintended consequences in terms of the overall effort that's going on. And, not just that people are going fishing, but how long are they staying out there fishing? And if they're staying out there an extra 4 hours to try and catch, those last couple of legal black sea bass, when they might have gone home hours ago happy with a 12-inch black sea bass, like Judy said, oh, we get all kinds of, we're catching a lot right just below the size limit. Well, yeah, because it's a gauntlet. And when you get 13 inches and you're in an area where there's a lot of fishing going on, you're kept. So your survival is until you get 13 inches. You get 13 inches, 13 and a quarter, bam. Someone's catching you and you're gone and you're caught. So yeah, what she says absolutely matches what's going on in this population. And you're probably making people fish longer, which isn't good. So we got high levels of encounters. We've got small fish discarding. Catch levels are not being met. And the future is recommended ACLs that are much lower. So we got this significant inland inshore availability. Lots of fish are going to be discarded, and those guys are not going to pay any attention to snapper group regulations. Nearly all of the fish today, wreck fish, are discarded, which is just destroys people's satisfaction. So how do we change that? Reducing the recreational bag limit, possibly doing the aggregate recreational limit that we've talked about for like 35 and snapper grouper and red snapper and other things. Let fishermen keep 15 fish or whatever they happen to get. Could, instead of a successful trip being 7 black sea bass, maybe it's 15 snapper grouper. And we have, we start changing the behavior of the fishermen. We change that assumption that the F in 2030, the discard F in 2030 is going to be the same that it was in 2020. And that's got to be our overarching goal. And looked at from the CERO ACL monitoring website. That's a great resource if you haven't been there. If you want to see the history of any of our fisheries, it's all right there laid out, commercial, rec, black and white. Just wondering how the fishery is done. So remember, we talked about 2013, where the stock was going, thought things were looking great. Raised the catch levels in 2013. The red on these lines is what the ACL was. The blue is what was actually landed, and it's commercial on the left and recreational on the right. So 2013, thought the stock was doing great. We raised it up. We actually had a closure in 2013 in the commercial fishery to keep them from going over that catch limit. But then look what happened in 2014. You go from a closure in 2013, didn't even come close in 2014, 15, 16, 17. Look at this. The commercial fishery, some of these guys out in the audience, some of you at the table know, hadn't come close to catching its ACL in a lot of years. Recreational fishery has done the same thing. We thought the stock was riding really high then, remember, and then we came along and did like CDR 56 and realized things maybe weren't quite so hunky-dory. That's when we had these drop in the red line where we're lowering the catch levels because, like, oh man, people aren't catching them. Yeah, the stock's kind of trending downward. Maybe we should be concerned. And what's important is we were already well past peak recruitment. We were well past peak SSB. Council just didn't know it at the time. The assessment couldn't have known it. It was into the future. But so that's why, even with those lower catch levels, landings, both sectors, continue to decline. Not coming close today to meeting the catch levels. These years are all past that 2011 population peak. Those graphs are starting in 2011. Nobody achieved the high CDR 25 ACLs from 2013 to 2019. We had the one here, and then we're not getting there. Commercial fishery last closure in 2013. Roy used to always talk about being concerned when you aren't catching limits. And I absolutely agreed with him, because when you don't have great numbers, if you're not catching the limit, it often means the fish are not there. When you do catch the limit, a lot of times it's because of a good year class, which was the other thing Roy always told us. He feared a good year class because he's going to be over the catch levels, and it's going to be because there's a lot of fish out there and everybody's going to hate him. So, being below an ACL is not always okay. And it's unfortunate management under Magnuson is so focused on the idea that being below the catch level is good and being above it is bad, because we have availability driven fisheries. We have hook and line fisheries, recreational, everyone considers that, but our commercial fisheries are hook and line, and they're really driven by availability. When they see a lot of fish, they're going to catch a lot of fish. They're not catching fish a lot of times it's because the fish are not there. And we're seeing this in this case. I mean, it's clear they were not catching the limit because the fish were not there, and we should be concerned when we're catching only a fraction of the ACL. Probably more concerned than when we're catching 110 or 120% of it. Because that probably means there's a problem. And we've talked about this at this table for every stock. I remember being in Georgia 10 years ago talking about gag and not catching the limits. Should we raise it? And fishermen like Charlie, going, no, because the gag are not there. Like, we're not catching them because they're not there. We better not raise the limit because it won't do anything. I mean, that stuff holds true, and you see it right here in black sea bass, plain as day. The other thing that's interesting is what has changed since 2018. So one of the things I look at in population is what's the fishery encounters percent. So looking at MRIP data, total number of fish that are being encountered, what is that relative to the population size? So what proportion of the fish that we think are in the ocean did a recreational fishery catch? And in some cases, we think it's extremely high. You know, the total encounters is the orange, and we see that going up. The percent of B2s is the gray, which is showing the percent of the fish that are discarded. As I said, it's approaching 90%. And then the blue is, again, the age one abundance. So what we're seeing is as the blue came down, y'all remember this declining limb strongly by this point. As the blue was coming down, the fishery encounters on black sea bass and emerald were going up. So the fishermen are continuing to encounter this fish while the population is crashing, which is counterintuitive. You think as the population gets lower, they should be harder to encounter. If anything, the percentage of encounters should maybe stay the same, but not go up. So it's almost like, fishermen are continuing to get after these fish. Were they getting better at catching them? Were the fish in more abundant in places like inshore where we have all that effort? Is this just something about, could this go back and change when we get an FES bias? I don't know, but I think it is a sign that something has changed in this fishery, which could make it harder to get back to those, say, 1990 discard rates that we need to get to have a viable fishery. But I think this is something that deserves some more research into what actually is behind seeing this fishery be able to encounter so many fish and do so well for a population that's in decline. So the other point we talk about a lot is increasing effort overall, particularly snapper grouper. Do we see this in the data? We have the MRIP. Inland and inshore is likely a factor in discarding, as we said. Nearly all the wreck fish are discarded. So what's going on in effort is going to be hugely important. So I looked at the South Atlantic effort trends from MRIP. This is angler trips by the different areas, with the inland area, which is, recall, inside the inland state areas, is orange, the ocean, so the 0 to 3 miles, essentially, the light blue, and then the ocean greater than 3 miles is green. This is all angler trips in the South Atlantic. This is not snapper, grouper, any individual species. This has got, trips that went to blue water to catch dolphin and marlin, to guys that fished inshore under a bridge to catch, sea mullets. It's got the whole gamut of fish that's in there. And the interesting thing here is 2020 highlighted. We didn't have surveys that year. We know we don't have a great estimate, but it does look like after 2020, so 2021 was a spike. Well, yeah, people had time and they had stimulus money. So we were all afraid nobody would go fishing thanks to COVID, and license sales in the states would tank, and exactly the opposite happened. People went out and went fishing. So I think the 2021 spike there is expected, and then we see the last few years a decline. People returning to normal probably. Our time is now spent more with work. But the interesting part is, and this has been the case for a while, the peak occurred back in around 2009, and it's down a little bit from actually what the peak was. And the other thing to point out is, and this is always good for you guys to remember, is look how little itty bitty the green part is. That's EEZ fishing. That's the fishing that you control. There's a huge amount of fishery that goes on in the inland and in the state waters. And this is why everything that we manage is a rare event species in MRIP, because our effort is a rare event species in MRIP. This is why we're in such a different situation and why we talk about this all the time. Offshore is only 5% of the trips, and it's been that way. It's really shown very little trend through the whole MRIP period of really deviating from 5%. So I think if we think effort is increasing, we've got to have to find a better way of understanding that, because the MRIP data, is not just showing us across the board that effort is increasing. This doesn't mean that more of those ocean trips are not targeting snapper grouper. That could be a whole other thing, and that's another can of worms to dig into and understand what people are catching and what they're targeting. But it does mean that to really understand effort and where the trends are going, we probably have to do a pretty deep dive into the MRIP program and some other data sources maybe to understand this. But, effective effort is also another thing. Fishermen get better over time. So even if the effort is completely flat, fishermen got better hooks, they got better rods, they got better line, they've got amazing electronics, and they've got spot lock trolling motors. So they're a heck of a lot more effective today than they were in 1990. And they've got social media and navigation, and everybody's putting spots on the internet. So, the effective, even if effort is going down, probably the effective fishing power is a whole other thing, which could be something else to look into. Just looking at this by air really helps to highlight just how low the ocean is. Same data, the ocean's the green down on the bottom here. You can see it's very flat, and it's always been a pretty low part, but not really increasing. The blue inland kind of increased in recent years. Increased from about 96 up to maybe 2020 had a spike. Everybody's down a little bit in the recent years, which we're not surprised. The economy, a lot of times this follows economic trends. You get a recession, you get a drop in MRIP effort. The economy recovers, you get a spike in effort. People got money to go fishing, we know how that works. So the last point here is, if a warming ocean is potentially impacting recruitment, won't it impact catch? The mid-Atlantic stock, as I said, moving northward, tend to be, believed in response to the warming ocean out there. Some of our species are suspected of shifting, like Spanish mackerel, more prevalent to the north. What about the southern end of black sea bass? So if mid-Atlantic stock's losing its southern end, what about our southern end? And I thought about this because, I've heard from people looking at one of them out there in the audience that said, we don't see black sea bass down in Florida like we used to. And that would seem to be the case, at least in the recreational fishery, and I know it's the case in the commercial fishery. So another look at MRIP data, just looking at the total number of black sea bass and MRIP by state, with each state being a different color. Florida's in orange on the bars, Georgia's in green, North Carolina's in blue, South Carolina's in purple. The green line that goes across there is the percent of Florida. So what's interesting about this is, first of all, you see the pattern that we've seen throughout this, where we had this increase in landings in 2013, et cetera, and then they come down. But Florida was 40% of the black sea bass were being reported by MRIP from, say, 89 to 91 in those early years. So over here, 40%. Recent years, avoiding 2020, 2017 to 2019, and here we're at 20%. That's a pretty big cut. And then 2021 to 2023, most recent years, down to 12%. So this is, this is circumstantial evidence. It's not proof of anything, but I think it does point us in a direction to look at, which is to understand what's going on with the southern bound of our stock. And if that was a very important part of the stock to its productivity, we may not get to that higher recruitment assumption of those OFL projections. We may be somewhere in the middle if our stock has lost some area and is not going to be as productive in 2030 as it was in 1990. And it's going to take a while for a stock assessment that's relying upon that long time series to estimate MSY and has come up with a 77 million average number of recruits to readjust itself to a different stock that's changing, this quickly from 40%, even 40%, 50% in 2010, that by now is down to 12%. That's a big shift. How important was that Florida area to overall reproductive of black sea bass? I don't know, but I think we probably need to have a handle on it if we're going to know where the stock is going. Good thing is, as Chip said, as long as you're not overfishing, your stock is going to rebuild to something. We may not know what it is, and in a practical sense, you don't have to know. Magazine Act demands that we come up with some number for it, but we don't necessarily have to know to get the stock doing better. So conclusions, maybe, I don't know, just some thoughts on this. I don't know if this wraps this up or not, but important, despite this assessment history, it's in constant flux and lots of input changes. The survey gives us great evidence that this stock is in decline. I don't think anyone can argue that. The writing's on the wall. Climate change might be part of this recruitment failure and loss of the stock on the southern end. So are those long-term projections based on historic conditions going to be realistic? Only time will tell. We're forced to do them for Magnuson and to come up with the rebuilding scenario, but we just need to take them with a grain of salt and understand things may change in the future as we learn more about the stock. The recreational discards are due primarily to the size limit are a challenge we have to solve. I think there's some ways to get there, equalizing size limits, looking at the bag limit, considering the aggregate. Those are things we're all talking about anyway, is trying to get a handle on the total amount of effort. And if we can come up with things that reduce the hours fished while still giving fishermen access in days fished, then I think that's a pretty good outcome for this fishery overall. And then the important part is those projections, assuming that current discard F continues, We've got to change that relationship if we're going to have a fishery that actually gives anglers satisfaction. And those loss of fish affect both sectors. So everybody involved with black sea bass has an interest in seeing that change so that we don't waste this resource any more than we have so far. And we get the most we can from the available production. So that's the last slide. Any questions?